Scott going to be able to lead troops into battle? Why? He's old. So he has to pick a field commander to lead the troops. Normally, the overall commander will lead these important battles and certainly would have led this first one of the Civil War. However, General Winfield Scott is too old to lead troops into battle, and so he appoints a field commander by the name of General Irvin McDowell. And you don't have to have these out in front of you, but I gave you pictures of almost all these people we're talking about. So General Irvin McDowell is not going to be the overall commander of Union forces, but he will be the field commander in this first march to Richmond with Union forces. So Union General Winfield Scott is too old for the battlefield, so he appoints General Irvin McDowell as field commander for Union forces. Okay? Now, what does the Union Army consist of at this time? We actually had 75,000 volunteers. We had so many, we turned some back. That doesn't mean they're all marching in this battle. The Union Army, going into the first Battle of Bull Run, consisted of 35,000 troops. Now, do you remember what I told you when Lincoln asked for volunteers, how long did they have to volunteer for? 90 days. Most of these 35,000 troops that are in the field now that are going to march onto Richmond and head towards Bull Run are at the end of their 90-day enlistments. So what's their attitude? A little bit different maybe than if they were just starting? You know, hey, I'm about done here, okay? But they thought they were just going to march in and take over. It wouldn't be anything anyway. So the Union Army consisted of 35,000 troops. Many of those 35,000 were at the end of their 90-day enlistments. Well, McDowell and the Union soldiers left Washington, D.C. on July 16, 1861. General McDowell and the 35,000 Union troops left Washington, D.C. on July 16, 1861. Where are they heading? To Richmond. Okay, very good. They left on July 16, 1861, and they marched for a period of time and took position near Manassas Junction, Virginia. So as they're marching to Richmond, they stop short of Richmond and they take up position at Manassas Junction, Virginia. It's a town, okay? And it's also a railroad center, okay? So Manassas Junction was a railroad center where railroads stopped and departed and loaded and those types of things just outside of Richmond, okay? And it was really pretty close to Washington, D.C. too, because the two cities are not far apart. So McDowell marches his men south from Washington, D.C. on July 16, 1861, and they take their position at Manassas Junction, Virginia, which is a railroad center really pretty close to both Richmond and Washington, D.C., kind of halfway in between. Now the Confederate Army, who's preparing for this assault, consists of 22,000 men. The Confederate Army consists of 22,000 men. Who are they commanded by? General who? You're gonna. P.G.T. Beauregard. So the Confederate forces, 22,000 strong, are under the command of P.G.T. Beauregard, the general in the Confederate Army. Now, the ironic thing is that the Confederate Army was stationed very close to Manassas Junction also, because they are protecting what? Well, not the capital, but what by the capital? That railroad center belongs to who? North or south? South. So they're stationed there, about in the same area, protecting that railroad center that Irvin McDowell and the 35,000 Union troops have stopped and organized themselves at. So they're pretty close together, right? So they know there's going to be a battle. And where's this battle going to take place? At Manassas Junction on Bull Run Creek. That's where you get the Bull Run. There's a creek running through Manassas Junction known as Bull Run Creek. So how many have heard of the Battle of Bull Run? Okay, how many have heard of the Battle of Manassas? Same thing, but the reason it's called Bull Run is because it was on Bull Run Creek by Manassas Junction. Now, the Union Army is so confident that they're picking blackberries along the way, just kind of stroll into battle, because they're going to go in there and kick butt and take names. They just think this is going to be a cakewalk, so they're stopping to pick blackberries along the way. This is like a doggone football game. There are sightseers that have traveled to Manassas, like senators, important people in Washington, D.C., women, girlfriends of soldiers and officers that have traveled to watch this first Battle of Bull Run. That's how confident the North is. So the Union Army are very overconfident. They're stopping and picking blackberries along the way. Sightseers such as senators, important people in Washington, D.C., women that are tied in with the officers or no hierarchy, so to speak. They bring picnic lunches and they go there and like they're going to sit in the stands and watch this battle like it's some sort of a sporting event. They expect this to be over just like that. Well, instead of a short battle, the Battle of Bull Run lasts all day. All-day battle at Manassas Junction. And these sightseers are going to get quite the sight to see. Find themselves where? In the middle of a battle. Okay? Well, during this Battle of Bull Run, Confederate General Thomas Jackson reinforced rebels, and he occupied a place called Henry Hill, south of the battle. So Beauregard is going to be reinforced by General Thomas Jackson. He's going to have a group of rebels, and they're going to occupy a hill called Henry Hill, which was south of the battle. These hills are going to be really important in the Civil War. Why are people getting up to the hills? High ground. Shoot artillery from there, shoot volleys from there. You want to be on the high ground. That's where you want to be stationed in these battles. Well, as Beauregard and the Confederates are doing battle with McDowell and the Union, who shows up? General Thomas Jackson with some reinforcements, and he gets his reinforcements up on Henry Hill, which is just a little bit south of where the fighting's happening. And what's he doing is he's planning to reinforce. Well, the battle gets kind of crazy, and several rebel soldiers get scared, and they turn and run and retreat from Matthews Hill, where they were fighting the Confederates, towards Jackson at Henry Hill. He's all of a sudden getting to the top of Henry Hill, getting ready to look down and see what he needs to do, and here are all these rebel soldiers retreating, running scared toward him from Matthews Hill. Okay? So this battle has gone on all day. Soldiers from both sides are probably bit off a little bit more than they think they're going to be chewing during this time. And all of a sudden, as Jackson's sitting on top of Henry Hill, south of the battle, he sees several rebel soldiers coming toward him from Matthews Hill, which they were defending during the Battle of Bull Run. Well, all of a sudden, Jackson stops these fleeing soldiers and rallies them back to the fight. Tells them to get back to the fight, get back to the fight. He doesn't let them retreat. He gives them confidence. Here I am. I'm here to help. Get back to the fight. Well, the person that witnessed this was another Confederate general by the name of Bernard Bee. Bernard Bee witnessed Jackson stopping these fleeing soldiers and rallying them back to the fight back on Matthews Hill. Get them fired up to go back. And as Jackson watched this, he was quoted as saying, "Look at Jackson, standing like a stone wall." And from that point on, Jackson earned the permanent nickname Stonewall Jackson. That's a true story. So, repeating that again, as rebel soldiers are retreating back towards Henry Hill from Matthews Hill, where General Jackson has reinforcements, he sees these retreating rebels and turns them around and sends them back to the fight. And a Confederate general by the name of Bernard Bee witnesses this, and he says, as he watches Jackson's heroics of getting these men back, he said, "Look at Jackson, standing like a stone wall." And because of that story that got out through the war, the history of the Civil War, Thomas Jackson would be referred to from that point on as General Stonewall Jackson. You ever heard of Stonewall Jackson? We've all heard of Stonewall Jackson, or no? Holy moly. Okay, it's a good thing you're in here. Well, by 3 o'clock that day, by 3 o'clock, remember it's July 16th, 1861, by 3 o'clock that day, the tide was turning against who? The North, the Union. So by 3 p.m. on July 16, 1861, the tide of the battle is turning against Union forces, and they begin to retreat over a bridge called Stone Bridge back to, where are they heading back to? D.C., Washington. So at 3 o'clock, by 3 o'clock on July 16, 1861, the tide is turning against Union forces. They begin to retreat back towards Washington, D.C., over a landmark known as the Stone Bridge. So the first Battle of Bull Run turns into a rout in favor of who? The Confederates. And all you can see is Union forces, senators, women all prettied up, all racing like crazy back across Bull Run Creek over Stone Bridge towards where? D.C. So the North gets their fanny kicked on this deal. Now, here's the first tactical mistake of the Civil War coming up, and you're going to have to kind of know these. As the North is retreating back to Washington, D.C., General Jackson urged General Beauregard to do what? Chase them. Chase them all the way back to D.C., get into D.C., kick their butt, on to D.C. We're going to win a victory there, and what's going to happen? The North's going to give up, and we're going to have two nations, one with slaves and one without slaves. Okay? So Jackson really encourages Beauregard to pursue the Union all the way back to Washington. He chooses not to. Why? Not because he's stupid, or not because he's a chicken. Why did he choose not to? What do you have a responsibility to do after a battle normally? Take care of your wounded. And that's what Beauregard chose to do. Rather than chase the Union back to D.C. and try to end the war in favor of the South by taking D.C. like this, same plan the North had in Richmond, he instead chooses to stay and care for his wounded men. This, according to historians, is the first tactical mistake during the Civil War, and it's going to be on the part of the South. Because historians believe that if the Confederate Army would have attacked all the way back to Washington, they may have taken Washington and ended the Civil War in favor of the South. But they chose not to do that. So tactical error number one, and you're going to hear about a few, South mistake, could have cost them a victory early. Now let's talk about casualties in this battle. Now, let's define casualties, because we're going to talk about casualties quite a bit. What is a casualty, Carly, my dear? Somebody that dies. What's another casualty? Well, not even mortally, but wounded. Okay, could be mortally wounded, which would end up being dead. Okay, but what's the third definition of a casualty? You're either killed, wounded, or captured. So the casualties, when we talk about casualties, we're not talking about just deaths. We're talking about those that were killed, those that were wounded, and if you were mortally wounded, you would fall into the dead category, and those that were captured. So here's the results of the first Battle of Bull Run. The Union casualties, 2,950. 2,950. Confederate casualties, 1,750. 2,950 Union casualties, 1,750 Confederate casualties. Okay, 2,950 Union, 1,750 Confederates. Now, you understand when I give you these numbers, they are pretty close, but they aren't 100%, right? Because we don't really know, but we're close. Now, here's what we got to talk about before we go on. This is a victory for the Confederates. They didn't lose as many men. They drove them back to Washington. But as we get later in the war, these casualties are going to be crucial. So if the Union loses 60,000 and the Confederates lose 40,000, does that necessarily mean the Confederates are happy? No, because take a look at the population. So it's going to get to the point in the end of the war that they aren't going to be able to afford to lose any casualties if they're going to win because they're running out of people. Keep that in mind. Okay, as we continue this subtopic, what do you think the Union's going to have to do once they get this disastrous defeat at Bull Run? Okay, just like I did when I gave you that disastrous multiple choice test in which I screwed about 4 answers up. What did I have to do? I had to re-evaluate and come up with a different strategy. Okay, that's what the Union had to do. They got together and they had to reevaluate and come up with a strategy that's going to work, because guess what they found out? This isn't going to be over just like that. If we have this kind of preparation, we're in trouble. Well, once they sat down and visited, they decided that their new strategy would be gain control of some geographical area that would cut the Confederacy in half. What would they want to gain control of to cut the Confederacy in half? When you look at the South. Close, what's next to Mississippi on the west side? Okay, here, he said Mississippi. Here's Mississippi. What's on the west side of the Mississippi? The Mississippi River. So the Union strategy is going to be gain control of the Mississippi River so they can split this off from this. Okay? So they want to split the Confederacy in half. So going forward, the North would try to gain control of the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half. Okay, now, I just want to set something up for tomorrow. We're going to talk about the first naval battle of the Civil War. It's kind of an interesting story. But then we're going to talk about 2 different theaters of the war. You're going to have to understand this. The Western theater will be battles fought in the western part of the United States, and the Eastern theater is going to be fought in the East. And we're going to go back and forth and talk about specific battles in those areas. So we'll talk about the first naval battle of the Civil War, and then we're going to move into Civil War in the Western theater, because the goal is to gain control of the Mississippi River. Okay, good job today.
Do you have a drill punch in your room?